Analyzing the transverse sections, we'll be moving from the superior to the inferior structures of the brain. First, what we can see on this transverse section, we can see two brain hemispheres, the cortex, the cerebral cortex, white matter of corona radiata, also the cerebral falx, the superior sagittal sinus, and of course the longitudinal fissure of the brain. Moving inferiorly, we open the lateral ventricles. On this level, we can distinguish the frontal lobe from the parietal and the occipital lobe. On the lateral ventricles, we can see their anterior and posterior walls formed by the corpus callosum, the septum pellucidum, which separates left from the right lateral ventricle. Can also here observe the head of the caudate nucleus and the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricles. Anteriorly and posteriorly to the corpus callosum, we can detect the cingulate gyrus, and under its cortex the fibers of white matter called cingulum. We can see superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, and falx of cerebrum. On this level, we open the anterior horns of the lateral ventricles, which anterior wall will be formed by the genu of corpus callosum. Lateral wall and floor is formed from the head of the caudate nucleus, and its medial wall is made from the septum pellucidum, stretched from the corpus callosum to the columns of the fornix. Posteriorly, we can see bodies of fornix, and then even more posterior, the bodies bifurcate into grooves of fornix. We can see the choroid plexus entering the posterior horn of the lateral ventricles. Laterally and posteriorly from the head of the caudate nucleus, the lentiform nucleus is located, and separated from it by the internal capsule. Again, the lentiform nucleus is separated from claustrum by the external capsule, and the last capsule of the white matter is capsula extrema. More medially from the internal capsule, we can observe the thalamus, which will then form the wall of the third ventricle. Laterally to the claustrum, you can see the cortex of the insula and insulae gyri, the central sulcus, which separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe and occipital lobe. On the corpus callosum, on this anterior aspect, we can see two pericallosal arteries, and anteriorly to them, again, we can see the cingulate gyrus, as we can also see it posteriorly to the splenium of corpus callosum. We enter the third ventricle, located in the diencephalon. We can see that the lateral walls are made from the thalamus, anteriorly to it by the column of fornix. If we move more up front, we can again see the head of the caudate nuclei, which will loop around in lateral ventricle to form parts of the lateral wall of the posterior horn. It is formed by the tail of the caudate nucleus. Also, laterally to the thalamus and the caudate nucleus, the internal capsule is located. We can clearly divide it to its anterior limb, its posterior limb, and genu of the internal capsule. Laterally to the internal capsule, the lentiform nucleus is located. On this section, we can divide it into the putamen, the medial and lateral globus pallidus. In the midline, we can see the splenium of corpus callosum, and more anteriorly to it, the pineal gland. Moving downwards, we are at the level of the mesencephalon. We can see two cerebral crus, substantia nigra, which separates the cerebral crus from tegmentum. In tegmentum, the red nuclei are located, and the line which runs through the aqueduct of cerebrum separates the tegmentum from the tectum. On the tectum, sometimes called the quadrigeminal plate, the colliculi are located, the superior and inferior colliculi. On this section we can see the superior colliculus. And also, posteriorly, we can see the vermis of cerebellum, which is covered by the tentorium of cerebellum. Moving laterally, we open the lateral ventricle. Opens its inferior horn. You can see the structures of the hippocampus, and anteriorly to it we can see the frontal lobe with the orbital gyri and the straight gyrus. Posteriorly to the frontal lobe and anteriorly to the temporal lobe, we can see the middle cerebral artery, and in the midline the optic chiasm, which is formed from two optic tracts and two optic nerves. Posteriorly to it, we can see the infundibulum and the mammillary bodies. Moving downwards, we're at the level in which the mesencephalon turns into pons. We can see the still present cerebral aqueduct, the tectum and the inferior colliculi, posteriorly to it the cerebellum, but now we can differentiate between the vermis and the hemispheres of the cerebellum. We can see the basilar artery, and anteriorly to it the hypophysis lying inside the hypophyseal fossa, to which laterally the two internal carotid arteries are located in the cavernous sinus, also laterally to it, to the artery. The oculomotory nerve is located. Now we're on the level of the rostral pons. We can clearly see the fourth ventricle, which floor is part of the dorsal pons, the rhomboid fossa, which we already know is its borders, upper borders, are created by the superior cerebellar peduncles. The roof of the fourth ventricle is made from the cerebellar hemispheres and the vermis of cerebellum. On this section we can also see the confluence of the sinuses and transverse sinuses. On this level we can also see the temporal lobes, also parts of the cranial nerves, the trochlear and abducens nerve in their way to the orbit. Now we are a bit inferior to the mid-pons. We can of course see the structure of the pons, the fourth ventricle, the nerve that arises from the cerebello-pontine angle, so the facial and vestibulocochlear nerve. The pons, as we already know, extends laterally and then changes its name to the middle cerebellar peduncle. In cerebellum we can still see the vermis, two hemispheres, and on this level the dentate nucleus. Anteriorly, inside the temporal bone in the carotid canal, the internal carotid artery. On the level of the caudal pons, we can only see structures of the posterior cranial fossa, such as, of course, pons, of course, the fourth ventricle, covered by the cerebellum, and by the inferior cerebellar peduncles. In the dura, we can see the occipital sinus, the falx of cerebellum, and this will be the last section of this model. Now we can see the medulla oblongata, the pyramids, parts of the olivary nuclei. Now we'll move to the coronal sections. We'll be analyzing the specimens, these plastinated models from front to back. So here you can see first slice of the frontal lobe. You can already, of course, detect the corpus callosum, the anterior horns of the lateral ventricles, the cingulate gyrus, the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, the inferior frontal gyrus, and the straight gyrus, and laterally to the straight gyrus, the orbital gyri. Moving on to the next slice of the same plastinated specimen, Here we have the left hemisphere. Here we have the right hemisphere. Already we can see the corpus callosum, the anterior horns of the lateral ventricles, and the separation between the lateral ventricles, so the septum pellucidum. Laterally, head of the caudate nucleus, and laterally to it, the putamen. Both these structures form striatum. We can also see here this small part on the bottom, which is called the nucleus accumbens. In here we can see the pericallosal artery, which lies on the corpus callosum. Okay, on to the next slice. The head of the caudate nuclei, the putamen, and the separation between the two, the internal capsule. Also, laterally to the putamen, we can see parts of claustrum, so between them will be located the external capsule, and more laterally, under the inflae gyri, the capsula extrema. Also, it's worth to notice this fascicle of white matter. This is part of the anterior commissure. On this section, we can already see the third ventricle, the lateral ventricles, the bodies of the fornix, which is grouped together with the corpus callosum, the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle, the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, the thalamus with the tuberculum of the thalamus, with the anterior nuclei of the thalamus, the cerebral crus, and medially to it the mammillary bodies, from which the mammillothalamical fasciculus emerges. Laterally, we can see the lentiform nuclei, and inferiorly, the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, the hippocampus, and superiorly to the hippocampus we can see the amygdaloid body. Also we can see the optic tract, and here we can see the beginning of the column of fornix, the anterior commissure, and under the anterior commissure you can see this cluster of the gray matter. This is what we call the ventral striatum. Also, on the basilar surface of the brain we can see the optic chiasm. Okay, we're in the next slice. The cut right here, pulvinars of thalamus. Again, the bodies of the caudate nuclei. And here we can see the trigon of the habenula. Inferiorly to that, this is of course the tectum with opened the cerebral aqueduct. In the temporal lobes we can see the structure of the hippocampus. So the hippocampus, the dentate gyrus right here. Okay, now the different point of view. Again we can see the structures of the thalamus, of course, the body of the caudate nuclei, and of course the thalamostriate vine. This little nerve right here, which stayed after the section. This is the oculomotor nerve. Now we are looking from the back on the parietal lobe. We can tell that this is the parietal lobe to the appearance of the intraparietal sulcus. More what we can see on this slice is of course the lateral ventricle, the choroid plexus of lateral ventricles, and the splenium of corpus callosum. Also in this side of the slice we can see structures of the hippocampus, and again from the other point of view we can see the pineal gland, parts of the tectum, the hippocampus, the body of the caudate nucleus, and right here the tail of the caudate nucleus. We can see splenium of corpus callosum, we can see crus of fornix, which then ended how it's changed to the fibria of hippocampus. This is the last coronal or frontal section. We are now in the occipital lobe and partly in the parietal lobe. What can we really see here is just the calcarine sulcus. And from the other side, of course, parts of the fibers of the corpus callosum and the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle with the calcarine spur. Lastly, I would like to talk about the mid-sagittal section and structures we can observe on it. Of course, we can observe parts of the cerebral cortex, the gyri, the cuneus, the precuneus, the cingulate gyrus moving into its isthmus, the medial part of the superior frontal gyrus, and right here the paracentral lobule with a bit this notch which we can see, which is the central sulcus. Then inferior to the cingulate gyrus we can observe the corpus callosum with its splenium, body, genu and rostrum, the septum pellucidum, which we know is stretched from the corpus callosum to the fornix, and right here we can see the body of the left fornix and the column of left fornix, and anteriorly to it we can see the anterior commissure, and if we move more inferior we can see the optic chiasm. Posteriorly to the column of fornix the interventricular foramen is located, and posterior to that we can see the, of course, the thalamus with the interthalamic adhesion and stria terminalis. Posterior and anterior to the thalamus we can see the hypothalamus embedded within the walls of the third ventricle.